this field for probably longer than I care to think, but at least for 3 or 4 decades. During that time, I've investigated a lot of cases, and some of my favourite cases have occurred during this one year, 1966. So just a quick background, just to bring it back to the paranormal, because this is a paranormal conference, that kind of thing is way back in the day, in the 1970s, when I was going to the University of New England up at Armidale. I was chairman of the Ghost and Poltergeist Subcommittee of the UNE Psychic Phenomena Research Society. That's back in 72 to 75, 73, sorry. And during the 70s, particularly through 76, 77, I wrote a 2-part article in a little magazine called Psychic Australian, which was coming out on the newsstands through news agents right across Australia, called UFOs, the Psychic Connection, 2-part thing. That basically, one part gave a kind of a broad overview of what the situation was like up to 1975, and the other half was basically Australian experiences that involved the paranormal connection. Also the author of the Westall Australian UFO story, and a bunch of other things here at the alien, which is a pretty controversial book on forensic approaches to alien abduction stories, and also Australian chapter author for the UFO history group called UFOs in Government, which came out in 2012. If you want one book on Australia, really on the government involved in the UFO mystery, that's the book to get. It's the size of a coffee table book, a very thick book, about 600 or 700 pages, and done by some of the best researchers in the field. Also quite recently, one of the more popular lectures I gave this 3 times, variation on the lecture 3 or 4 times. UFOs, alien abduction, contact, and the parapsychological connection. If you want to, as paranormal researchers or people that are interested in paranormal, if you want to go to a field of human experience that where the paranormal connection is really strong, check out the UFO field, because a lot of the UFO witnesses and that kind of thing have had tremendous paranormal experiences, and even in the UFO experiences themselves, there's strong paranormal components. So, there's been many amazing years in the Australian UFO story, and the journey that I've had through the whole UFO mystery. Now, just as a bit of introduction and background on what's gone before and what's gone after, I'll give a little bit of background and just quickly go through a number of years before we really focus on the one particular year, 1966. A long time ago, 1868, good old Parramatta, one of the more amazing kind of early UFO mysteries, and that's of Frederick William Birmingham. Now, he was a Parramatta surveyor, and also an organ on Parramatta Council, where that adds to his credibility, or takes it away. It's hard to sell these days with political processes, but he, in a journal, recorded how a flying ark landed in Parramatta Park. It was taken on board, shown strange equations, that kind of thing. It's a really complicated story, but one of the more interesting stories, I was able to confirm the legitimacy, at least historically, that the document seems to be a very old historical document, and certainly Frederick William Birmingham literally existed. Did a lot of things with Parramatta Council, engineering works, surveying work, map work, all that kind of thing. So, but very complicated story. One of my other favourites of pre-1947 UFO sightings was way back in 1927 up near Moolumbar, a place called Fernvale. The fellow here, Seth McGann, he was 10 years old at the time. He and his family experienced incredibly weird phenomena at this place called Fernvale, a sort of dairy farm, and its closest approximation was something you might be more familiar with 40 years later, the Mothman prophecies. Most of you are probably familiar with the Richard Gere movie. Do yourself a favour, go back to the book, John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies. Really, it's probably one of my favourite books, probably not for its factual basis, but the fact that it's best looked at as a gothic UFO thriller. So it's a great book to read. But in there was a whole mass of UFO experiences, sightings of birdmen, light creatures, cattle mutilations, alien abduction stories, contact stories, all that kind of stuff. A lot of that was playing out in 1927 near Moolumbar in Australia. So, fascinating mystery. 1953, one of the more interesting long-term mysteries, the Drury UFO film. At the time, during the 50s and 60s, it was often referred to as the Holy Grail of Australian ufology, mainly because it was a film taken by Tom Drury. He was the Deputy Director of the Department of Civil Aviation in Papua New Guinea, which at that time, in 1953, was an Australian protectorate territory, and so he was a very highly placed witness. Takes a daylight movie footage of what appears to be a fast-moving object flying over Port Moresby. Along the top there, you can actually see frames from the film. Now, for many decades, the film was missing. It was handed over to the government. The government sent it to the United States. Allegedly, the key parts of the film came back with the UFO section deleted. Although the family did have a section of film which they gave me a copy of, and this is where these come from. You can actually see the object moving across fairly quickly. It became the centre of a whole lot of interesting mysteries, and one of his close friends there, Laurie Schutte, was the local Asia guy. I interviewed Laurie Schutte, and he's, I think, the person who followed up after him in Papua New Guinea, Ken Donovan, both of them Asia guys. They recollected the film, but they weren't part of the analysis or anything like that. They just made sure it got to Melbourne at the time. After that, it was in the hands of the RAAF and the government. But a story of a missing film. 1954, flying mushrooms in big time. Lots of stories, pilot sighting on the 1st of January. For those who are interested, I wrote an article in UFO Truth magazine, which was coming out of the United Kingdom, edited by Gary Heseltine, a former policeman. It's a great magazine, but I did a piece there called The Flying Mushrooms of 1954, Solid Light on the Show, question mark, because the pilot saw an object and this long thing coming out at the bottom of the object. Solid light is a really interesting part of the UFO mystery, where whatever's behind UFOs seem to be able to manipulate light, make light do what we think's light, do crazy things, pick up things, all that kind of stuff. So it's a really fascinating part, and it could be a real interesting pathway into an advanced technology. If we could manipulate light in the same way as it appears to occur in UFO cases, we would have some extraordinary technology. The best we can do at the moment is we can possibly pick up something in the size of a dust particle. Actually, we can't pick it up yet. We can push it, and I think in the last couple of years, Chinese researchers have been able to pick up equivalent to a dust particle, and that's about it. But in UFO stories for decades, we've had stories of so-called solid light where they've been able to pick up people, pick up cars, a whole box of dice. If we could do that, fantastic technological leap. Again in 1954, the Sea Fury radar visual incident, shot naval pilot, James Farrell, tracked on ground radar, encountered with was flying a Sea Fury, which at that time was the fastest plane in Australian skies. The radar operator, Keith Jessup there. This was regarded by Dr. Alan Hynek as one of the best radar visual cases from anywhere in the world. Very credible witness. I've met James Farrell many times, and a highly credible witness. Famous case from 1959, Balwyn, Papua New Guinea, where a missionary, Father William Gill, and members of the Navy Commission there, like about 30 or 40 people, on 2 consecutive nights in June, saw a craft with animate beings moving backwards and forwards and interacting, even waving when they waved at them, kind of thing. So it was a very interesting case. For me, it was a physical trace case where a permanent mark is left behind. That was my key entry point into UFO investigations. Bunga on the north coast of New South Wales. Now, that property there was owned by the local member of the House of Representatives, parliamentarian, Mr. Ian Robson, and my family knew him, so I got a bit of an entry point into this area. And like, I was only a kid at the time, but like hundreds of other people, we all went to Bunga and looked at this flattened area. Now the UFO connection wasn't very clear at the time, but later on I was able to find cases that occurred in this area at that location, and people weren't keen to come forward and say what they saw, but it seemed to be a fairly substantial connection that a flying saucer or UFO was involved. Now, 1972, some action that took place while I was at the University of New England, at Armidale. There's, on the same day in September, when I was coming back after a 4-hour chemistry practical class, UFOs certainly were on my mind. All I was interested in was getting into the canteen there at the college dorm that I was staying at and having some dinner. And I see this dish-shaped object straight across, a shiny metallic object at about 200 or 300 feet. But early that same morning, at a little property outside of Armidale, a place called Mount Butler, there was this apparition type phenomenon, a very striking encounter here where several students were living on that property. There was a disturbance outside. They saw this, it looked like a monk in a shroud, black face. One goes out. They're all looking at it, and it seemed that it disturbed the horses. One of the horses that belonged to favourite one of the guys there came up, reared up in front of him, and appeared that this thing disappeared in a flash of light, went into the horse, out of the horse, and then into him. He collapses. Everybody's terrified, and it seemed like a case of possession almost. He was sort of incoherently sort of reacting to this. That location, Mount Butler, became the focus of a real intense UFO wave the following year, mainly through one witness. So it was a really interesting experience. I was able to investigate that. In 1973, Turingham on the Dorrigo Plateau, this really was my baptism of UFO fire. Really, it was a very intense, highly localised UFO flat. The kind of thing that UFO researchers live for, basically. And I was right in the thick of it, with a bunch of UFO researchers myself, and I was going up there practically every weekend, witnessing UFO phenomena. One of the main things that came out of it was that the UFO phenomena at that time was highly elusive. It was like it was playing games with us. You know, we'd set up heavy-duty cameras on tripods that no camera shape. They'd be appearing night after night in one direction over a mountain. We'd have it all set up, ready to go. What would they do? They'd appear behind us, and then they'd play games like that all the time. So it was a really interesting phenomenon. One set of photographs were taken, but apart from that, the phenomenon was pretty elusive. It wasn't just lights, it was objects and that kind of thing. A lot of paranormal type stuff there as well. In 1973, there was also a major case at Northwest Cape. That's the joint US-Australian facility in Western Australia. This UFO sighting was witnessed by the fire captain on the base and the lieutenant commander of the base independently. Occurred on the same day that base was used for a full nuclear alert by US authorities. Now, the problem for us was that the US did not tell the Australian government that they were using Australian soil to issue a full nuclear alert. And so that was under the Prime Ministership of Gough Whitlam. There's a lot of controversy involved in this story, but it was a fair dinkum case. I got a hold of the documents on that one. It was a really interesting one. 1976, Ben Boyd National Park. Well, my UFO researchers were in South Australia. There were for the UFO conference and the total eclipse as well at Mount Gambier. There were a bunch of people down at Tayola Point with Ben Boyd in the southern part of New South Wales, but they were waiting for the eclipse as well, and saw this UFO, a number of UFOs photographed it, and it was subjected to early computer enhancement. It seems to represent a bona fide UFO. Another major mystery, big year, 78, major worldwide UFO flat. For us here in Australia, this story was the biggest story. It's probably the premier aviation mystery in Australia, the disappearance of this pilot, Frederick Valentich, over Bass Strait. But it's also a major UFO mystery. And the pilots never been found, the planes never been found. And he was involved in a 6-minute conversation. I've heard that tape quite a number of times, and there's a lot of imaginative reconstructions and fake transcripts and fake audios of it, but the real tape is interesting enough in its own right. The transcripts are confirmed in terms of the documents that appeared, but there certainly was a UFO connection in this, and a very striking year in Australia and worldwide. For me, this is one of the best so-called UFO physical trace cases. Close encounter of the second kind, according to Dr. Hynek's definitions. This is, for me, I'm trained as an industrial chemist. This kind of thing is really significant for me because UFO is seen, highly credible witness, that's myself and the witness on location, object seen to land. He created a model to show what it looked like, and that bottom picture is from Channel 9, which shows the landing site. We're able to take soil samples. There were differences in it, but not enough to be significant, that kind of thing, but a very interesting case. Also involved the removal of 10,000 gallons of water from a concrete water tank where the object seemed to sit on top of the water tank, move off and land beside it, so very striking case. 1982 was a big year for me as well. I got to get access to the government UFO files in Canberra and spent, I think they expected me to turn up for an hour or two, look at the files and walk away. Well, I turned up on Monday and left on the Friday. So they probably gave access to the wrong person basically. But I went back 4 times and looked at the totality of the files. It convinced me I was seeing most of the files at that time that were held by the RAAF. 88 and 92 were big years because I got involved with this case, Peter Curry's UFO experiences, alien abduction experiences in Sydney. Now this case represents a real breakthrough as far as I'm concerned because it was the first time that we're able to take a biological sample, a hair sample, and subject it to DNA analysis and some fairly detailed studies. And the hair sample turned out to be remarkably unusual. Not absolute proof of an alien, but it suggested that there's something unusual here, possibly like a hybrid type DNA, because the DNA in the root of the sample was different to the DNA in the shaft of the hair. So, very striking case. Peter was also, certainly not through my recommendation, but he agreed to do a polygraph test. Now, I don't regard polygraphs as very reliable lie detector tests. It was a subject to so much error. But he decided to do a DNA test. I think it was on the Mary Rodwell documentary, My Mum Talks to Aliens, and he passed that lie detector test. And that might be impressive to a lot of people, but to me, personally, lie detector tests are a very unreliable measure of truth. Now, I'm personally convinced that Peter's had real experiences. I told him that it's not worth the risk with such an unreliable tool to do a lie detector test, but Peter was convinced and he went ahead and did it. So he passed, and so it's that's another substantiation of the credibility of the story. But for me, the DNA, Peter's personal integrity, all that kind of stuff is fairly convincing. If you want more detail on that, the book Here at the Alien focuses on that case.
Excuse me, I was just wondering where the hair sample was actually taken from.
It's a delicate story. There's numerous accounts of this on the web. I didn't want to focus on these. This is just a real fast introduction, and then we'll focus on 66. But it's a very interesting story, and I really encourage you to get into it. And perhaps Google my name on the internet, and you'll get plenty of the stories about this case. Through 2005, 2006. I went to China 3 times, lectured at a number of different universities. The level of UFO interest there is quite amazing, even to the academic level, universities, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of interesting data there. Now, a lot of people think that UFOs don't land anymore. The only thing that you find is crop circles. Well, to me, crop circles is more about field art rather than UFOs. But there are still substantial close encounter cases. This is one that took place in Coogee, one of the busiest suburbs in Sydney, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 a.m. in the morning. Young fellow walking down the street, encounters this in the middle of the street, that spherical shaped object with an entity or something inside this window, appeared to be holding a lever. He was terrified. He hid behind an electrical signal box, and the visual trace aspect of it was that the road itself was burnt. Within a day or two, the local council had repaired the whole area. I wasn't too thrilled about that, but and also the telegraph pole that you can see there that's highlighted, that was totally removed and replaced, and nearby trees were burnt as well. So it was a really interesting case, but unfortunately, the local council got him too quickly. There weren't any explanation as to why they replaced the. They reckon that the telegraph pole had been damaged, but they weren't prepared to go into any detail about it. So, that's just a very quick trip through a number of interesting years within the Australian UFO experience. Now we'll focus on 1966, a really amazing year. I think you'll agree by the time I'm finished here. So it's 50 years ago. Now, this is one of my favourite cases, Tully. Tully, this story got a lot of publicity when it occurred on the 19th of January 1966. There were a lot of things going on in the Tully area, a lot of sightings, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, it was all kind of generally seen as just the locals in northern Queensland, that kind of stuff, nothing to worry about. When George Pedley had his daylight encounter, this went viral, so to speak, in modern terms. He was just a young banana farmer crossing across his neighbour's property on a tractor, and his tractor starts to miss, and he's wondering what the hell's going wrong with it, and he hears this noise and looks across to a little tidal lagoon. It's shaped like a horseshoe. That's why it's called, oddly enough, Horseshoe Lagoon. And it's mainly got sword grass, this very sharp, kind of razor sharp, kind of reed type material in the lagoon, very common in that area. He hears the disturbance, he looks across, and rising out of the lagoon, he sees this 25-foot wide object. It seemed to be a definite kind of object rising up out of the lagoon, and this will give you an impression. This is what it's like often. This is one of the photographs that were taken shortly afterwards. There was this compacted area of sword grass that literally ripped up out of the bottom of the lagoon and matted together in a clockwise direction so tightly that it formed its own natural floating pontoon on the surface of the lagoon. And it was so tightly wound together that people were able to sit on it, like a floating lagoon, pontoon. And this is the sequence that he saw. It rose up, went into a slight dip, took off at high speed. Now, the RAAF didn't really look at it in much detail, but they relied on local police, but they did visit eventually. They explained this away as a willy-willy, sucking up all the sword grass, forming a tightly matted disc that flew away with the willy-willy. The problem for that was that the sword grass hadn't left the site. It was all sitting there, floating on the surface of the lagoon in this not natural, well, hardly natural, unnatural floating pontoon on the surface of the lagoon. So the explanation didn't really set well with most locals. And the thing to bear in mind here, this was not a nighttime experience. It was really a close encounter within 20 to 30 feet. 9 o'clock in the morning, bright sunshine. The weather was mild. There was no wind disturbances or anything like that. No real conditions for a willy-willy, that kind of thing. So, on YouTube, you can see these are recreations of the case taken from a program called Close Encounters. It came out of the Discovery Channel in Canada. 2 years running, they kindly provided a trip to Canada, to Toronto, and a whole bunch of us were over there helping them to try and recreate all these famous UFO cases over 2 seasons. The series went for a couple of years, so it hasn't gone for the 3rd one. But overall, it wasn't too bad. But unfortunately, when you have researchers trying to stick to the details and the accuracy, and then you get the creative types that make it make the series, they start to get a bit creative, they pull out details, you know, and for me it's like spot the errors and that kind of stuff, and you could find plenty of them. But overall I thought they did a pretty good job with a lot of these cases. And for the first time this series highlights solid light cases, and I was kind of using that, the visits to Canada, and they were asking me who else to get in to talk about other cases. I would nominate various people around the world, like in Germany and France and others, and the United States. So it was an opportunity to have little mini research gatherings running on the back of this TV series. So if you want to see a really interesting series, check it out on YouTube or various sites. It's called Close Encounters. It was run on Discovery Canada, the Science Channel in the US, and I think it's been here on Foxtel, I think. Not using cable, I wouldn't know, but I gather it was run on Foxtel here.
Yep, it was.
I think they did a reasonable recreation. It's the recreation of the owner, Albert Benisi, and George Pedley, the nest. This is photographs of the actual event, George Pedley and Albert Benisi, the real guys. I met both of them. I spent time up there in the Horse Lagoon. I think it was Albert Benisi's son who said to me after I was wading through the lagoon, he said, "Oh, you better watch out for taipan snakes." Well, at that time, they reckon I was like a UFO coming out of the lagoon. A couple of dogs had been killed a day or two earlier, so I didn't see any taipans. So. Now, the interesting thing, there was a conference given by UFO Research Queensland, their anniversary conference in 2006, and they managed to get Albert Benisi, the owner of the property, to give his first and last lecture. Unfortunately, sadly, he's died recently, and I did a kind of a tribute to him. And it was called Albert Benisi's Dream Machine. Now, the reason for that, and the documentary Close Encounters actually brings this part out. This is the paranormal element. You know, you couldn't get a much better physical nuts and bolts case of an object taking off, bona fide UFO, physical trace. But here, there was also this underlay of paranormality to a really strange element. One that Albert, as a well-known banana farmer in the area, really didn't want to get out, but it did leak out. He unfortunately mentioned it to a journalist, and there were references to it, but highly distorted references. But he told me about it as well, and a number of other people as well. And what it was this recurring dream that he had. He'd heard about UFO sightings in the air, and he thought, he didn't know what to think. He thought, you know, they may have too much grog or whatever. You know, oh, I know some of these people, they're usually okay, but God, what's going on? But to him, it was just something that locals were experiencing. He didn't know what to think. But then, for about a week, he had this recurring dream of this bit of a frightening dream of a UFO appearing on his property, and it kept waking him up. A dog would feature in the dream. The dog would bark like crazy. So if you look at the documentary on YouTube or whatever, look for the, I think it's called A Saucer Full of Secrets, they call the episode, Close Encounters, and it really focuses on the dream part. And so when George Pedley, his neighbour, comes screaming up to him, "George, you won't believe what I saw," and he says, "I think I know what you saw." You know, and because his dog had gone crazy, just like in the dream, he'd been barking and pointing towards the lagoon, and he and George went down to the lagoon and found this floating pontoon. And it's George actually sitting on the lagoon. All that swirled around reeds were actually tightly meshed together, so he could actually sit on it. So, very amazing case. So, I guess from a paranormal point of view, you'd see this as precognition or whatever, crisis happened, whatever. It's certainly an unusual element. And for Albert was embarrassed to talk about it. You know, he really didn't want to talk about the dream aspect. This is from the Close Encounters show, showing Albert waking up from one of his dreams. they did get a little bit gratuitous in terms of the recreation of the dream, but it was kind of scary for him. Now, another case, there was this trilogy of cases, 3 cases that occurred in Victoria, April 5th, April 4th, April 6th. 3 of them, the most interesting cases, apart from the Tully case that occurred in 1966. And the first one was a photograph that was taken of a suburban Melbourne, Balwyn, the suburb of Balwyn, on the 2nd of April. Now, that frame is from the documentary Westall 66, Suburban UFO Mystery. We're going to play that at lunchtime. Apparently they're having some technical problems. I think you can get access to this on YouTube, but I encourage you to buy the DVD and support the documentary makers, because this is one of the best documentaries I've seen on UFOs. Rosie Jones, the documentary director, she really did an exceptional job in terms of research. Very deep, detailed research over a period of several years. And it just shows me they're talking about the case, but that list there is my shopping list that I used when I went into the RWF files in Canberra. I was looking for documents on particular cases, and top on the list were Balwyn. Next one, Ron Sullivan's case from Burkes Flat, and of course Westall, which a lot of people will know about, that occurred on the 6th of April. Now, it was a businessman from a highly regarded business family that had deep interest and connection, particularly to engineering businesses. The family was actually doing a lot of business with China during the 50s and 60s. One of the few Western business people to have connections with China. So he was one of the last people you expect to be dabbling with the UFO, flying saucers and stuff, you know, and yet he took this photograph. Now, the first impression one has when you look at that photograph, it's too bloody clear. It's something like a white bell or something like that tucked up. It's taken on the Polaroid, but once you understand who the person was that took the photograph, how it was photographed, the type of camera, it was a Polaroid camera. Now, you can do this kind of faking or double exposure with a Polaroid camera, but you had to have the right gear. But the gentleman concerned was actually in the garden, his parents' garden. He was asked to look after the flowers. His mother and father were overseas at the time, and he goes in the garden. He's got a few. His mother wanted some photographs of the flowers, so he decides to use what's left on the Polaroid. And he knew it was a pretty old Polaroid. He wasn't sure whether it'd come out. And as he's about to take some photographs of the garden, this thing appears. It seemed to be gyrating in unusual ways, flips into the horizontal position, which is rather odd, and then takes off at high speed. Now, their local handyman was around the other side of the house. He had a direct line of sight to the gentleman concerned, could see him taking photographs, getting agitated and yelling out something, and then he rushes over to the handyman, and they both sit there and see the development of this thing on the Polaroid. So a lot of interesting details that suggest that possibly wasn't a hoax. Now, I've met this guy and talked to him. I've been a friend of his since about 1988. So to me, the photograph is the least interesting part of the whole situation with this gentleman. He has had some quite extraordinary UFO experiences. You can go back as a 10-year-old or 8-year-old in 1944 in suburban Melbourne, an abduction type experience. A whole lot of interesting experiences in China, a lot of UFO related and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure what to think of that photograph, but it's it was looked at by the local Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society. It's a sketch report form. That's the report by the handyman who made a statement about it. Now, being a businessman, he didn't want this photograph to leak out, but because of his UFO interests, he was a member of the Flying Saucer group, and he loaned the photograph, or a printed photograph, to the head of the Victorian group, and told him not to publicise it. What happens? it was publicised, the story leaks out, and you get this story. After that, things went crazy for this guy. He said he was absolutely besieged by intelligence interests, government scientists were turning up at his house. One particular scientist was seriously obsessed with the whole thing, ringing him up day and night. This CSIRO scientist, Dr. Burson, he was very interested in it. He did an analysis of it. He couldn't find signs of fabrication, that kind of thing, so he regarded it as a really compelling photograph. Burson was an interesting guy, atmospheric physicist. He was actually being used by the RAAF to be a consultant on some flying saucer cases. One particular major case from 1963 down at Maui in the Gibson area, another close encounter. He'd had his own sighting, so he was quite interested. That's more of Burson's analysis. Now, that case and the three major cases I'm going to talk about in Victoria at that time, the Balwyn photograph, the next case I'll be looking at is the bent headlight case in Burkes Flat, and the Westall School case, made it a really big year for Victoria and Australia. And the book there, Firestorm, is the biography of Dr. James E. McDonald. Now, he was one of the leading world's atmospheric physicists, and he became really interested in the flying saucer problem. And he was literally like a firestorm. Came into the UFO subject and was pushing government and politicians. He had major connections worldwide, and particularly in America. Came very close to getting breakthroughs, but in the end, unfortunately, sadly, died of some sadistic, committed suicide, and the evidence is fairly strong that he did commit suicide. He wasn't knocked off because of his UFO interest, or a lot of aspects to that. But he came to Australia in the year following 1966 and interviewed most of the major players and most of the UFO's major stories at that time. And so a lot of his documentation is extremely valuable for the investigation of this. Now, these montage of photographs here on the right are from the recent Channel 10, or Studio 10 coverage of the 50th anniversary of Westall. Now, they managed to get my friend there, the businessman, to sort of appear on camera, in shadow and from behind. That's the first time he's spoken publicly about it. So he wasn't identified, but his name's out there anyway. It doesn't take long to find out who the guy is, but he says there's a big difference between being public in the UFO circles, but he didn't want to go public full time kind of thing. Now the second case in the trilogy of Victorian cases is the Burkes Flat case from 4th of April. Now, this is often referred to as the bent headlight beam case. Now, this, to me, is one of the most striking cases ever. If this is literally as it occurred, it defies physics as we understand it. Now, he's, the gentleman concerned, Ron Sullivan, he had a metal construction business based in Maryborough. He was doing a lot of building jobs all around the Victoria area. He's travelling down this remote country road at a little place called Burkes Flat. Now, there's no village called Burkes Flat, it's literally just a location, farming property, it's going to be quite isolated, travelling on a straight road. He's travelling down this road, he sees a light off to his left, and the following slides will show you the suggestion of what he saw. He's travelling towards it, and as he got to within about 50 feet, if you take a right angle from the road to where this object was in the field, as he got closer to the position on the road, he realised his headlight beams seemed to be going off to the right, and he thought he's driving off to the right. So he decides to turn to the left to compensate, and he's literally heading straight off the road to the left, almost collides with this tree. So his car actually wasn't deviating, it's the headlight beam. Now, most the few documentaries that have tried to recreate this case, they all get the headlight bending aspect of it wrong. And I'll explain this to you, but it's really significant in terms of trying to understand what happened. This is kind of a recreation. This came in Westall 66, the documentary. This is looking from above. You've got the road, got the object in the field, and it's kind of like two discs, one smaller at the bottom, one larger one at the top, which was harder to see, and between it were these kind of streams of multicoloured light coming up and down, and the top part would come down towards the bottom slowly. And as I said, this right angle aspect where if you take a line from where the object was in the field to the road, the headlight beam started to go towards the right instead of directly ahead, and then it seemed to bend in a V shape back onto the road. And the closer that he got to that right angle point to where the object was, the more acute the bend was. So you literally have this kind of V shape closing up like this from the car, literally almost bending back onto itself. So it's a really weird effect. These are from report forms that he sent to the group that I coordinated. I certainly wasn't involved at that time, back in '66, but more from the report form. Now, in the field, was found this depression at the location. No serious work was done on this in terms of chemical analysis, which was unfortunate. I did go back to the field back in 1980, and using all the photographs that we had, got to the actual point. Now, I thought it was a long shot anyway, but I thought, as a chemist, I wouldn't be able to sleep if I hadn't done this, but I did the analysis, but there was nothing shown. But bear in mind, it was an agricultural field that had been used for crops many, many times over the decades, but so it was hardly surprising nothing was found, but at least I did due diligence and did the work. Here's Ron Sullivan with the depression in the field. The tree, well, you can see the tree behind the car. That's the tree where the one without the leaves rather, was the one that he nearly collided with. That becomes significant because unfortunately, a few days later, a young man, Gary Taylor, driving down exactly the same road, hits that exact same tree. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. So it was a fatality. Now, what are the chances that two people have an experience? One person dies, the other person manages to get his car back onto the road, all because he thought he was driving off to the left. It was the headlight beams that were going off to the left of the car. And when he tried to get back, he almost collides with that same tree. So the police at the time, looking into the fatality, weren't that interested in the flying saucer connection. They didn't want to have a bar of it, basically. More details. That's myself interviewing Ron Sullivan in 1984. The drawing on the left shows you the sequence that he saw in the field. Now, I worked really hard with Close Encounters, the documentary people, to try and get what Ron Sullivan saw, and they do it fairly well, so it's worth looking at. Unfortunately, they made some mistakes as well, a few dramatic flourishes. They have Ron Sullivan stopping and getting out of the car. He never did that. He never stopped the car. He slowed down, but he certainly didn't stop. And this is kind of the sequence that you're seeing here. It's one of the first time that they actually managed to capture this right. So it's a very unusual kind of event. I wrote a sort of detailed account of it, the bent headlight beam case revisited. And that was based on interviewing Ron Sullivan in detail, going back to the site, doing a lot of reconstruction work, doing analysis, all that kind of stuff. So it was a fairly detailed investigation. Now, as you can see from Close Encounters, they didn't get the headlight beam right, the bending of it. It should have gone off to the right and bending in a V towards us. National Geographic also had a look at this case, but bizarrely they didn't even mention the headlight beams bending. The major feature of the case, all they focused on was he saw a light and Gary Taylor dies. That's it. They didn't even mention the bending of the headlight beam. This is the sequence you can see, showing the more and more acute V-shaped bending that goes on the closer the car got to the point opposite the object in the field. Me as a scientist, this case is spectacularly interesting for me because it shows that UFOs, or whatever they are, they seem to be able to at least manipulate light as we know it, our own sources of light. And as I said earlier, with solid light cases, they can use light, or what we think is light, from themselves, from UFOs. They seem to project these beams, or what appear to be light, but it isn't light as we know it. They can seem to change into hollow tubes. They can go from a solid seemingly to a liquid. They can pick up people, pick up cars, all that kind of stuff. So amazing stuff. That's myself pointing towards the tree that was involved in the fatality on location. That's a photograph on the left from the inquiry, the coroner's investigation. Shows the major skid marks heading up towards the tree which he eventually collides with. Now that photograph on the right is myself holding the headlight canopy of Gary Taylor's car. Now that canopy, the headlight canopy, was picked up by Paul Norman, the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society guy. They didn't really do anything with it, but they fortunately passed it on to a friend of mine, Dr. George Stevens from the Atomic Energy Commission, and we were kind of wondering what we could do with it. Well, we ended up trying to do a magnetic signature test, the idea being that if the headlight beam of the car had been bent, one scenario that might explain it is that it was in the presence of an intense magnetic field. The problem was with that hypothesis, if it was intense enough to bend light, Ron Sullivan wouldn't be here telling us the stories. It would have had a pretty severe effect on him. He does report, though, when he got closer to it, that he felt a very peculiar sensation in the stomach, the abdomen, as if it was almost like it was being dragged towards the object. Really peculiar feeling. Now, the science in me thinks that maybe there's a lot of, well, human body's full of water, maybe a lot more water in the stomach area, and that was the effect that he was feeling, but certainly it wouldn't have been enough to bend light. The hypothesis was that with the magnetic signature test, if you're familiar with what, you get a bar magnet, you throw metallic particles onto it, and you can see the pattern of left to right sort of magnetic flow around the magnet. Now, we hypothesised that if the car had been in the presence of an intense magnetic field, all the lines of magnetic force would be going in one direction, all wiped out by this intense magnetic field. But as you can see with the chalk marks, where we've worked out the lines of magnetic force across the headlight beam, they're all entirely random. So it doesn't appear as though the headlight was in the presence of a magnetic field. So it's still a puzzle. There's other ways that we're trying to work out to figure how to explain this, but it's all pretty complex science, so I won't get into it. Now, Ben Hurl of the new group, Victoria UFO Action, did a really good retrospective investigation. Now, I passed on to them a lot of my photographs and stuff like that that I'd done back in the 80s and in the 70s and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the tree where the fatality occurred is no longer there, which is top and bottom photographs matching my investigation in 1980 with Ben and Rifa's investigation in 2013. So we're just trying to recreate the two shots, and they did some really good work and found some interesting bits and pieces of information. Now, one of the things about Burkes Flat was that it was haunted, but not haunted by ordinary ghosts. It was haunted by balls of light and light that would pursue some of the colonial people while they're going past in their horse and carriage kind of stuff. And Burkes Flat got a reputation for being haunted. Balls of light coming out of the nearby dams, that kind of thing. Again, myself with Ron, and there's Ron now, more recently, with Ben Hurl on location. And Rifa did a good thing. They made a plaque commemorating the investigation, but also the death of Gary Taylor on the site there, so they anchored that on one of the trees there on location. So it's a nice sort of memorial plaque to the event. Unfortunately, a lot of these plaques tend to go missing after a while. I hope it's still there anyway. So. Now, I mentioned the CSIRO scientist, Dr. Burson. Now, in the United States, I don't know how familiar you are with the UFO field, but in the end of the 1960s, the United States Air Force, they wanted to get out of the UFO game. It was their public kind of, it's like a noose around their neck. They could never investigate it. They didn't want to be involved with flying saucers. And so they commissioned the Colorado University to do a $1 million investigation of the UFO subject. Now, for those who have seriously investigated the Condon Committee, what's we call the Condon Committee report because it was directed by one of America's leading physicists, Dr. Edward Condon, so it became known as the Condon Report. Now, for scientists like me, well, at the time when I read it, back in '69, I wasn't a scientist, just a kid, and I read it about 5 times, cover to cover. It's a long, detailed report. I thought, what the hell? You know, like, here's Condon at the beginning recommending that there is nothing to the UFO subject, period. Not worth looking at. Science should just move on. In fact, they should discourage students from looking at it and give them demerit marks if they want to get involved with UFOs. And here I am reading this thing thinking, yeah, what about that? You know, like a third of their cases they couldn't even explain. They were unknown. And yet Condon somehow ignores his own study and comes up with his own conclusions. And it was evident, and the documents have appeared since out of Condon's archives and also from the archives of Ron Craig, who was a chemist working for Condon in this committee, that was literally a fix from the beginning, that they were only ever going to come to one conclusion, and that was that it wasn't worthwhile investigating. It was only a kind of a show trial, so to speak, just to get the US Air Force out of the public UFO game. Now, Dr. Burson, the Australian scientist from CSIRO who was involved with that photograph case, he somehow naively thought this was going to be a serious scientific study, so he started sending stuff to the Condon Committee. This is from one of his letters, and he mentions, here I mentioned Burkes Flat. He says about Burkes Flat, there was an unexpected appearance of DA investigating. The DA is equivalent to Department of Air Force back in those days. In other words, Air Force intelligence officers, RAF intelligence officers. Now, appearance of investigators at the apartment of a man, Ron Sullivan, the guy that I mentioned that was in this Burkes Flat case, who had reported an unusual phenomenon a night or two earlier. He was shown an album of photos and asked to identify, if possible, what he saw with any of the things shown on the photos. He was shown them in very rapid succession and was not given an opportunity to refer back to any of the photographs shown in this folder of UFO photographs by the Air Force. You know, if you get, like I did, if you go looking for an RAF case investigation file on Burkes Flat, there isn't one. It doesn't exist in the Air Force files. And again, also for Westall, which I'll discuss in a moment, given the involvement, and we can confirm that there was involvement, certainly at least from the RAF, there should be an RAF case file. They don't even include either one of these major cases. 2 of the most significant cases from 1966, none of those appeared in the RAF's annual summary. So something funny is going on there. We know they investigated it, but there's no data. Now, about Westall, Burson writes to the Condon Committee. On another occasion, they established the fact that a similar DA team had appeared so quickly on the scene of a sighting made by a group of school children and a teacher in the vicinity of an aerodrome as to make one believe that they had foreknowledge. In other words, they were expecting the UFO at Westall. Now, the teaching staff was asked by the DA men to play it down, and the sighting was promptly ridiculed, yet quite independently, another group of people had reported the unusual phenomenon from an opposite peripheral area of the aerodrome. So it's a really curious and interesting guys, from somebody who was sort of on the inside. That's Dr. Burson. But the thing about this Westall case with Dr. Burson, when he tried to go to the Air Force, he had been Air Force's consultant on previous flying saucer investigations. When he went to the Air Force and asked them for the data, what did they do? They told him basically to bugger off. He wasn't allowed to have any information about Westall, but he was obsessed with Westall. And the Balwyn photograph. These are photographs of the newspaper headlines. Now, most of the coverage was a couple of stories from the local newspaper, the Dandenong Journal, and you could virtually miss the very small stories in the main Melbourne newspaper. So it was largely ignored by the media except for the local Dandenong Journal. The Victorian Flying Saucer UFO Society at the time, Judy McGee, Peter Norris, and Paul Norman. Now they went to Westall. Photograph at the bottom there, Shane Ryan, the Canberra academic, has been very prominent in getting a much higher profile for the Westall case. There with Paul Norman and Judy McGee, both of those have passed away in recent years. Now, these are two photographs taken by the Victorian group back at the time. That photograph on the left seems to show a sort of a semi-circular area. There were a number of different circular areas found at the site. And also one of the witnesses, young student Joy Clark, when this photograph was shown to me, there was no identification on the photograph, but I'd already met Joy and I said, that's Joy. And sure enough, she confirmed that she was the one that was photographed here. She got into a lot of trouble for being interviewed by the Flying Saucer group from the school. The headmaster berated her. They were told not to talk to the media, not to talk to anybody about this. But Joy being Joy, she spoke to everybody basically, did a bit of detention after school, that kind of stuff. Here's Burson's comments about the case, again we've covered that. Dr. James McDonald, when he was in Australia, he did a fair investigation of the Westall School case. Now, McDonald interviewed one of the school teachers. Now, a lot of people think that Westall was all witnessed by school children, but it wasn't. There were numbers of teachers involved and also members of the local public around the school saw the UFO as well. Now, McDonald interviewed Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher. A lot of copious notes about his investigation. Now, Andrew Greenwood says that the reason why he played it down was that he received a visit from what he believed to be Air Force investigators who basically threatened his future career path if he talked about it anymore. Now, he had already spoken to the Dandenong Journal and his account came out in the papers within a few days. But he was told that if you keep talking about this case, you may not have a teaching career. In fact, it may come out that you're an alcoholic now. Andrew Greenwood was not an alcoholic, in fact he wasn't a drinker, but he was told that he would be discouraged, that his reputation would be severely damaged. So that's why he's been generally non-available. He doesn't really want to talk about it. Even to today, he's fairly reluctant. He has talked to investigators about it and confirmed it. Now, back in 1966, my book, The Oz Files, Australian UFO Story, I did cover this in about 6 pages, called it the Westall School Sensation. I concluded there is little doubt that something of an extraordinary nature was seen over the Westall School area, and that at least one of these objects appeared to have landed and apparently left behind some physical traces. Numerous witnesses confirmed these basic details. Other more exotic details vary in credibility, some seemingly complementing each other, and some apparently contradicting the generally accepted story of events. So that's pretty much how it stands today. Now, I looked at this as kind of, with the Shane Ryan, the Canberra academic, he's done some really fantastic work, particularly with the benefit of social media, Facebook, and all, the internet and all that kind of stuff. That's allowed a greater level of traceability and contactability with a lot of witnesses. It really helps connect people. A lot of people love Facebook and the internet. A lot of people hate Facebook and the internet. I'm a pretty heavy hate and love relationship with Facebook. I hate it sometimes. Most of the time I hate it, but sometimes I like it. But I call this the sleeper awakes because it was a real sleeper of a case. Now, over the intervening decades, people like the Victorian group, myself, George Simpson, a couple of other investigators, Pete Bascom, we've had contact with a number of the student witnesses and some of the teachers, but certainly not in the numbers that we know about now. And it was with Shane's diligent investigations that the profile of the story has gotten big time now, regarded as one of Australia's best cases. So that's why I call it the Sleeper Awakes. Now, here's Shane Ryan, George Simpson, myself on site in 2006 for the 40th anniversary of the case. And that was great because a lot of students, a lot of witnesses, school teachers, deputy headmaster, all that kind of stuff, all came to that reunion. And also too, on site was Rosie Jones and Carmel McAloon, who were people involved with the documentary. Now, I urge you to have a look at that documentary if you haven't seen it. I think it's, as I said, available on YouTube, but buy the DVD, because I like the work, good work, support the documentary makers. And they did a fantastic job. But bear in mind that it's such a complicated case that you're only just getting a tip of the iceberg in the treatment of this story. It's got a lot of publicity. At the bottom of the shot there is Joy. The early documentation showed was actually an extract from the school magazine that was written by one of the students. Now, the fellow on the right next to Joy was the student that wrote that piece. But he was given such a hard time by the headmaster that he declined to use his real name. But he admitted to having written that piece for the school journal at the time, back in '66. This is DVD, the main copy on the left that you'll get from the makers of the documentary. The one on the right, actually without my permission, but I'm not going to cry about it, they used my drawing that I created of one of the close encounters that occurred at Westall. This is the Sci-Fi channel. There's only a limited number of copies of that disc available. But that's where it was first shown on Australian television by the Sci-Fi channel. And it was very, very popular when it came out and was appeared several times. Now, the documentary Westall 66 does this brilliant recreation where I thought it was a really fantastic touch, where they did it all in kind of charcoal drawings, the view of the event from a child's point of view, because obviously most witnesses were school children. And so that part of it, I've got a bit of an artist background as well. I just thought it was a brilliant recreation of the whole story and really brings it alive. Himself on location at Westall School. Now, this gentleman here, Victor Zachary, he was one of those witnesses who didn't talk about it for decades. In fact, he told me that in the wake of the event back in 1966, he's probably been 10 at the time, something of that nature. He was actually like a bit of a scallywag type character, typical skill kid, but he was a gifted artist. And he was one of a number of the school students who were taken in and interviewed by Mr. Sambleby, the principal of the school. Now, Sambleby says to Victor, according to Victor, that he says, yeah, Victor, I'm not going to tell you you can't talk about it, but it's probably a good idea that you don't, because I know why you're a bit of a troublemaker some of the time. You have a great career ahead as an artist. And if you come out and start talking about flying saucers and this thing that happened at Westall, it's not going to do your future career any good. Now, that sounds like a cover-up or something like that, but then Victor says that Sambleby, the headmaster, said to him, the reason why I'm telling you this is from personal experience. So I had a similar experience that occurred while I was in the army in Papua New Guinea during World War II, and unlike you, I spoke out about it, and he suffered because of it. Now, Sambleby, the headmaster, was one of the old school type headmasters, a strict disciplinarian, didn't want to lose control over his school. And when the Westall UFO had occurred, it was pandemonium. You had journalists, military, Air Force, intelligence, all that kind of stuff coming on site. Sambleby actually didn't want anybody on site. He wanted to maintain control over the whole school. But Victor's story is really interesting because he says that he comes flying out of the classroom, sees the UFO, or he actually sees a whole bunch of school kids over by the nearby fence line, he runs over. There was one teacher he remembers there, and he comes running up. There's a good recreation of this in the Close Encounter documentary. He comes running up to the fence. He hears the teacher saying, "Don't go over the fence, don't go over the fence." What does he do? He immediately goes over the fence. Now that was the kind of kid that Victor was. And what he sees over the fence are these two other kids and two objects literally within a few feet of the ground, hovering above the ground. And I met with Victor on site at the exact location to do one thing, and that was to do a detailed forensic recreation of his experience so that I could make a drawing as accurately as possible with what he saw. Now he has done his own drawings here of what he saw, and this is my sketch based on his account given to me. Victor off to the left by himself. You've got the fence line, the teacher, and all the kids behind the fence. Now, this is a real close encounter. It's clearly not something that can be explained away. He says that he didn't pay much attention to the other school kids. He's there standing there next to one. He was so close that he was going to go up and touch it. And as he got towards it, he could feel heat. And that's what made him think, no, I better not touch it. And at that point, both objects simultaneously went straight up into the air, a few hundred feet. One of them circled a Cessna aircraft flying over at that time, and then it took off to the west, I think. The other one took off and went down into the neighbouring Grange market garden area across the road from the school. That's where the rest of the school took off and chased the UFO down into the market gardens. Teachers are yelling out, "Don't go, don't go." In fact, I talked to the school captain who got a lot of hard times from Sampleby, who really berated him for being so undisciplined to allow the rest of the kids to go across the road. So he got talked down to by Sampleby. And what did Victor do after having this close encounter? He didn't follow the rest of the kids. He went home for lunch. I said, "Victor, what did you go home for lunch for?" He said, "Well, I've already practically touched the bloody thing. I don't need to look at it anymore. I'm going home for lunch." But he also said that it was exactly the same UFO that he'd seen a few years earlier, very early in the morning when he's down on the factory site. He's down there, as a school could typically be, he's down there to steal a wooden pallet to make a billy cart. And so he's there dragging this pallet out of the factory illegally and sees this object coming along. And instead of being in the horizontal, it's in turned on its side, pointing exactly like it looked in the Balwyn photograph. So he thought the Balwyn photograph was a really interesting photograph because it kind of captured what he had encountered in the Balwyn Westall area a few years earlier. So Victor had enough of UFOs that day, that's why he went home for lunch.
We've actually run out of time, so
Yep.
would you be available to take a couple of questions?
Sure, yeah. Can I just wrap this up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. These are recreations for the documentary. They did a pretty good job of it. There's an explanation suggesting it was a highball balloon that came down. No chance of that being an answer because there's a secret Prime Minister's Department memo that sort of doesn't even talk about Westall that was done 4 weeks after the Westall event. It doesn't mention Westall. If it happened and it was highball, this high altitude balloon thing coming down the school, it would have been mentioned. And there's a scientist that was involved with highball who actually, he wrote a memoir that had flying saucer account in it, but it's of a high-level highball balloon. Now, in the last week, we had a similar NASA balloon go to Australia that created lots of UFO sightings. Exactly the same sort of thing suggested in highball, but highball is not the answer to Westall. And 66 was my big year. Police sightings in Grafton, my hometown. And it was also the year that Australia became aware of alien abduction stories. The first accounts of Betty and Barney Hill's famous story that was documented in a bestseller book that came out in 1966 called The Interrupted Journey. And there's only a couple of slides left. In 1966, in suburban Sydney at the suburb called Belfield, an 8-year-old girl encountered alien greys in a very complex abduction case. None of this came out at the time, but it came out much more recently. Decades later, as a mother herself, with her own children, they experienced alien events in this historical building here in Parramatta. Now, why that's significant to me is that that house in Parramatta where her own children had this experience recently was the home of Frederick William Birmingham, the guy from 1866, had the alien encounter. So really interesting things come around big time in the UFO subject. So that's myself and Doug Moffat doing a recreation of Frederick Birmingham's experience at that very place. His little place still exists today, wearing period costume. So it was a big year, and just to close off, encounters the Katoomba kind. My group, UFO, started off in 1956, and the very next year was a big Katoomba event, major UFO event over Katoomba. And the first secretary was a 16-year-old girl, Judith Crozier. She was the one who came up with the name UFO, or UFO Investigation Centre. Now, I've made contact with her, and she's a really good friend now. She said that in 1950, in May, Katoomba, she and her sister were walking down the Prince Henry Cliff Wall, the Jameson Valley there, and they're walking along 10 or 13, and they see these strange structures down there in the Jameson Valley. For anybody who knows the Jameson Valley, there's nothing like that that's ever been in the Jameson Valley. But they looked at it and thought, what the hell is that? They thought somebody's made a big dome thing down there in the valley, and they're walking along the walkway. And unfortunately, they didn't come back the same way. So they didn't see it come, they didn't see it leave. But certainly nothing like that exists down in the Jameson Valley. But that's what they saw. That's a photograph that was taken back about that time, and she's reconstructed what she saw. And just to end off on a curious note, Bush Christmas is a very much beloved film that was taken and filmed around Katoomba. It's got Chip Stratford, he's one of our famous movie actors in it. Bunch of bush rangers, I think he's a bush ranger, and a number of kids that are trying to, they've been stalked by the bush rangers. And if you go to 39 minutes into the film, filmed around Katoomba, is this thing sitting off there now. It could be cloud, could be anything, but it's certainly there. And that's Chip Stratford riding his horse there in search of the kids. Past it, but you can watch the film on YouTube. Now it's Judith Crozier that she's got an eagle eye for this stuff, and she said one of my films I love the best, and I was watching it recently, and I saw this, and it's like gold. Yeah, it is. It's for Katoomba, it's like full circle. Thanks so much. And just to wrap up, I've got 4 copies of the Oz Files, the original 1966 book here, if anybody wants to get hold of it. It's scarce as hen's now, but I am going to create probably a digital version of it, which will be very majorly expanded on the published book, because the published book sort of had about half the original manuscript size in it, and plus I'll be updating it and all that kind of stuff as well. So, but probably only as an ebook.